of risk for the United Nations Environment Program's Finance Initiative, or UNEP-FI. We really work with the financial sector to accelerate sustainability on environmental topics. So we convene the net zero alliances that you may have heard about for banks, for investors, for insurers. We also, in my programs, really try to develop resources by working with scenario modelers, climate experts, and others to really engage with these topics in a important and deep and meaningful way. We are kind of, I joke sometimes, a mixture of a think tank and a convening hub, but really the goal is creating the resources that will help accelerate sustainability. And I also wear a couple other hats academically. I am a senior associate with Cambridge University, where I really try to work at the intersection of climate and nature. I also run an advisory practice where I work with various individuals in central banks across the world, developing climate stress tests, reporting guidance, really trying to help them see what their peers are doing. And as you'll see in this discussion, there's a set of global standards that I think is important for you to understand, not because necessarily all of your roles will involve helping to complete these, do the analysis for them, attest to them, but really because they have been at the center of this movement around climate and climate-related financial risk. So what I'll be talking about today really kind of draws from my work over the last several years, but I'm just super delighted to be here. I think these kind of forums are so important because this is really not only a chance for you to ask questions, but also to see how work is connecting with that of your peers. And I'm just here really, yes, as an expert on these topics, but really to facilitate that journey that you're on, because to be honest, it's not so different than the one I was on. It wasn't something that I started out thinking that I would work in climate and sustainability. I had started in the financial sector. I had started academically in psychology and history. And I realized in a lot of ways that climate and sustainability topics really brought all of these skills and interests together for me. So as I talk, I'm happy to not only get into the details of some of this guidance and its importance, but really give you the opportunity to ask questions and hopefully, as I said, help you on your own journeys. So anyway, just delighted to be here and looking forward to speaking soon. So I'm going to go through this. I think the presentation will take around 20 minutes or so. Don't hesitate to jump in with questions, but we will have also a dedicated Q&A at the end. So if you feel like there's something you want to note down and then come back to, we can do that too. So for Irene, I'm going to go through these materials. As I said, anyone feel free to cut in, but after that we can have a little bit of a discussion based on this and really why it matters. So with that in mind, we'll go on, and I'll start with this quote from Mark Carney. He was the head of the Bank of England. He was also the head of the Bank of Canada, two different central banks, and was really one of the people in the mid-2010s who began to speak out more directly about the importance of climate in the financial system. And you can see here that it's not just what we sometimes talk about the impacts of climate change, but even shifting to a net zero world really has effects that will demand that finance changes its operating model. And so what I like to tell people is these are not sustainability commitments. These are really strategic commitments that firms need to be making. And those that aren't going to make them are going to be unprepared for the future. So take whatever example you want, whether it's the horse and buggy company, whether it's the typewriter company, whether even nowadays it's the internal combustion vehicles. If you're going to be obsolete and your operating model isn't going to work for the world we're in, you are not going to be around. And that is a major challenge for global economies, but it's also, of course, relevant for the financial sector. So I'm not going to spend too long talking about the diversity of risks of climate change. I actually think to be honest, from the having read some of the materials that Yongo has put together in the past, I actually think many of you are probably better informed about some of the science and about some of the risks than many of the people in the financial sector. Sometimes I like to joke I am teaching high school teaching high school science to a group of financial professionals on some days. And so the points, though, that I want to make by this page is just to really show that there is a diversity to climate risks. I think a lot of times we have all of our specific ones that come to mind: sea level rise, it might be extreme heat, but it's the integration of these, a just overall more challenging natural world, one that has health consequences through air pollution, one that has impacts on geopolitics through resource conflicts, through environmental degradation, changes even in the frequency and prevalence of disease and potential new disease vectors spreading. We've seen this with Lyme disease, we've seen this with malaria. But the point is that these things really matter globally, and they don't just simply reside in a single hazard of, oh, well, sea level rise is going to mean more flooding, but I don't really live near a coast. Or, oh, wildfires are really bad, but I don't live in Florida, I don't live in California, or I don't live in Australia, or I don't live in British Columbia. So, that's not as much of a risk for me. The point is that there's almost nowhere and almost no sector of the global economy and no country that won't experience this diversity of risks. So that's, I think, one of the first points. I think it's helpful also, though, to think a little bit like a financial professional. And the way that this has been set up over the last few years is to think about two types of risks when we consider climate change. We tend to consider what are called transition risks and physical risks. Transition risks tend to be the types of risks that come as we try to bring the global economy to net zero. This is, if we combine these things, this is a technology transformation, this is an energy transformation, and this is a policy and governance transformation, all taking place at the same time. That's a lot of change all at once. And so we like to talk about breaking those risks into three types. Policy risks, meaning the shifts in policy. In some cases, legal risks can fit into here as well, so litigation. Technology risks, so how do new technologies displace existing ones? Think about solar panels replacing a coal plant as the source of distributed power. And then how do markets begin to price these things? What kind of volatilities result as markets begin to say, oh, actually, we don't think those fossil fuel assets are worth very much anymore. Or, oh, actually, we think we do need to write off the investment we made here. And so if that's the kind of change and the shift to getting to net zero and decarbonization, on the physical side, we have something different, which is these two types of risks driven by changes in the climate system itself. We like to break these ones into what are called incremental risks, sometimes called chronic risks. These are risks that are slow moving over time. For those of you maybe that are a bit more statistically minded, these are really shifts in the baseline or in the average. So how hot is the average temperature? How much rainfall on average are we getting? These are the kinds of shifts. How high is sea level in a particular area over time? Then we have what are called extreme events. These are the ones, acute risks. These are the ones that become newsworthy, the ones that you see picked up, extreme floods, heat waves, fires. But these are the short-term consequences. So again, for those who are more statistically minded, these are the extremes, the tails of the distribution. These are the deviation or the variance in the climate behavior over time. And so we see both the shift in that average, but also the shift in the extremes. And so if that's how financial institutions think about climate, then what are some of the little lessons we can take away? I think one of the first ones is when I talk to institutions, I try to give them a bit of clarity around what you should be looking at when you're trying to look at a scenario for the future, you're trying to understand things. There's so many different factors, it can get confusing. So I try to simplify it down to start with, if you think about it, the more mitigation we do, meaning the more we lower our carbon emissions, not just CO2, but all CO2 equivalents, the more aggressively and the faster we do that, the more of a transition challenge we're going to face, because doing that means a bigger deviation from our current economy. it will ultimately have big benefits, but it will also have volatility in the short term, which means as financial institutions, if we have companies that we've already written loans to, that we've already underwritten insurance for, that we've already invested in, we need to be attuned to that. Now, the other factor, if we say the transition risk in the future scenarios is sometimes governed by how quickly that CO2 emissions needs to fall, on the other side, how severe physical risks are going to get. When we think about what the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change says, most of the climate factors, most of the impacts are moderated by temperature. So if I want to know how bad a scenario is compared to another one, all else equal, the higher temperature scenario and the temperature that remains higher for longer is going to be more severe. So I like to call this the ice cube and the oven problem, which is to say the two factors that really tell you about physical risks, all else equal, are one, how hot did the temperature get? So how hot is that oven? And also how long was that oven on? So if you put an ice cube in an oven, the amount of melting you're going to get will be determined by how hot the oven is, yes, but also how long it was in there. And so the longer we stay at high temperatures, the more risk we face. The higher those temperatures are, the more risk we face. And sometimes these don't exist in a linear one-for-one fashion, but sometimes it means that slight changes in temperature could have bigger consequences. So if that's sort of the universe or the world that we try to think about when it comes to climate change, then what I would say is, as we go on, thinking about how do these things translate from being potential economic challenges to being financial ones. And so we've talked about a number of these different physical risks. We've talked about some of these transition risks. And now when we think about why those matter for financial institutions, let's think through that. For a flood, for example, that could disrupt power, that could disrupt transportation, it could disrupt the availability of the workforce, and thus cause a loss of potential profits, a loss of sales from activities. Similarly, supply chain disruptions could mean that prices spike because we're not able to produce enough of the materials needed. We could also see damage directly to assets. Imagine a strong storm damaging coastal real estate, damaging a power plant. Also, when it comes to resources, the resources that are faced, say if one country says we're going to ban this activity, well, now maybe it means that the overall energy price becomes higher. And so that might have a cost for businesses that are not even related to the energy sector. Maybe they're healthcare businesses, maybe they're other ones. And then finally, we know that as people are shifting in what they want, whether it's the purchase of meat, whether it's the purchase of internal combustion engines, these preference shifts are also going to have consequences, and we need to take those into account. So if those are the cases, I like to take this to say what we've kind of talked about now are the light blue and the gray. We've talked a little bit about how certain impacts in the physical and transition risks can then result in economic consequences. Now the question is, if you're a financial institution, what happens if properties are damaged? What happens if businesses are disrupted? What happens if markets dry up? Well, for you, as somebody who has provided the financing, you might be more likely to see people not repay on a loan that you've issued them. You might see assets that you've invested in lose their value because they become stranded because nobody will use them. You could also similarly see operational and potentially even legal risks if you're sued for continuing to finance fossil fuels. So all of these, as I said, are ways in which the physical and transition impact the real economy and thereby, by extension, impact the financial sector. So if that is sort of the universe that we're talking about as the financial sector thinks about it, the question then becomes what to do. And so one of the first thoughts on what to do from a financial standpoint came from the Financial Stability Board. And so in 2015, the Financial Stability Board brought together a task force focused on climate-related financial disclosures, really saying, as you might suspect, these are newer topics for many institutions and individuals, so the information really isn't there. How do I know if your company is exposed on a supply chain to major flooding? How do I know if your company is dependent on revenues it gets from fossil fuels? If those things aren't made clear to me, then I might make the mistake as a financial actor or even just as an individual investor of saying, oh, I'm investing in your company. Oh, but I didn't realize that you were actually exposed to all of these risks. So the idea here from the Financial Stability Board in creating this task force, which I'll continue to refer to as the TCFD, or Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, the idea behind that TCFD was to give organizations better information about the climate risks that they face, but also give those in the marketplace better information. So in the same way that we would be flying blind, or if you imagine driving without a map, we're not sure where we're going. Similarly, without information about these risks, as well as the opportunities, we won't know where we should be putting our money. We won't necessarily know where the big risks might emerge. And so to improve the both integrity of the financial system, but also to better manage these risks, the TCFD put together a set of recommendations around these 4 different pillars: governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics and targets. And within these 4 pillars, they aim to provide a comprehensive view of the risks and opportunities that that firm faces, both how it's governed, what the strategies are for addressing it, what risk looks like, and then how to really quantify these things by the goals the firm has, the targets, as well as some specific measures. So I'm not going to read this entire list just because it's more of a reference for you. But within those 4 pillars that I've mentioned, there are 11 specific disclosures. And those 11 disclosures really aim to ask some of the questions. And I'll give a few of those questions just so you can see what we mean. Ask some of those questions of how a firm really is dealing with climate change. So at a senior level, do the senior executives who are responsible for the firm know about what the risks are? Are they involved? Are they responsive? Tell us about that. Tell us what what management is doing. On the strategy side, we know that the strategies may change over time. How will they change over time? So tell us not only in the long term, going to net zero by 2050, but what is the path along the way? What is the short term and the medium term? Risk management means, how do we actually know that we're picking up the right risks? How do we actually know that we're including these in our main risk management? If we build models and we do all of this work, but we don't actually include climate in our decisions, then it's kind of been a useless exercise. So how do we make sure that you've integrated that into your processes as they already exist? And then for metrics and targets, great, it's terrific that you have a goal now. Well, tell us what progress you're making against that goal. You want to be a greener institution? Well, tell us what your emissions are over time. Tell us what the emissions are of the clients and those that you finance. All of these are different things that we can do that really help us and really give us the clarity that progress is being made. So I want to just, maybe give a couple examples just for you to get an appreciation of what goes into these reports, as well as what the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures was trying to do as they did them. The first is around governance and the governance pillar. Good governance really begins with good senior leadership. And so when I look at reports, when I look at assessing them for firms or with various leadership in different governments and organizations, I'm really interested in who knows what they're doing. So understanding the education and training that has gone on, but then most importantly, what responsibility and incentives exist. Do you have plans in order to tell the leadership that these are not only goals that have been set, but goals that they're incentivized to meet? So does their compensation connect to that? Do they also have specific committees and specific plans that help them oversee this? On the strategy side, how do we actually think about using scenarios? We know the future is going to be increasingly uncertain. How do we recognize that reality and take advantage of it in an effective way, not just by saying, okay, we've looked at different scenarios, but saying, how does our strategy change? If we're in a world where climate impacts are happening a lot faster, how do we shift to resiliency? How do we ensure our organization is resilient? Similarly, on a transition side, some of that progress on transitions will really depend on the strategy that we put forth. On the risk management pillar, we really like to see firms integrated and trying to stay at the cutting edge of what the industry is doing. So are there new tools, new methods, new ideas that are coming in that are helping in this area of what we call business intelligence? Similarly, are those risks actually getting into your own financial activities, into your decisions? If they're not, then they're really going to be falling short of being as effective as they can be. Finally, on metrics and targets, as I said, we want to know what your goals are. We want you to measure progress against those goals. And we also want you to measure progress against peers. Let us understand what sort of emissions you have. Let us understand what sort of exposures you have to high-risk sectors, high-risk areas. So that way we can better help understand and manage those things. So if that is kind of the overall area of the 4 pillars and what we're really looking at, I would mention one other major development that has come out in the last few months, and that is to say the work of the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures was started in 2015. Their first guidance was released in 2017. They continued to update that guidance, and in 2021 released more guidance on things such as climate transition plans and on metrics. However, all of that really is simply a step along the way in getting global regulation to move forward and move faster. And so, as I said, I work a lot with global supervisors. And one of the big things we do there, one of the big areas of focus is really trying to help those supervisors develop guidance that people can use in different locations. Because at the end of the day, we know that business is global. So we know that what we want to do is create supervision, regulation, and guidance that's global. Imagine having 2 different standards in 2 different places. It would be very hard to compare activities in one place versus another. So fortunately, the IFRS Foundation, which is the International Financial Reporting Standards Foundation, they put together the International Sustainability Standards Board at COP26. And in doing so, they really aim to take up the mantle of the TCFD and not just apply it to climate, but extend it to overall environmental risks. And so that really has been the main goal and main objective of these standards. And so these were released just at the end of June, but are really based on the framework that I've laid out for you here today, and will continue to be ones that regulators around the world adopt and then require of financial actors and corporations in order to provide the information that's necessary to make better decisions about climate change. And so that's really where we are today. I'm happy to speak to you about any of the specifics, both of the International Sustainability Standards Board, called the ISSB, the TCFD itself, other related topics like climate stress testing and climate risk. But I also want to make sure that we focus on the things you're most interested in. So with that, I'll hand back to Irene. I'll stop sharing my screen and we can go from there.
Thank you so much, David. You definitely touched on a lot of things. And I can imagine what's going through the minds of, the different participants here, being that it's a diverse pool of, individuals, some who already have that a bit of a level of exposure to climate finance related topics, while some others are just new to it. However, I like that there was that balance, and a couple people might have had questions while you were making your presentation. So I don't know. Okay. Someone already has a question. Amazing. Please, for those of you who have questions, kindly drop them in the chat section. And if you want to ask your questions directly to David, please just indicate by a show of raise of hand, and we would call you to have a tete-a-tete with David. But this was a lot of good, yeah. Okay, Stephen has decided to, yes, Stephen, so over to you. Please, I've sent you a request to unmute yourself.
Thank you so much.
Please introduce yourself and then
of course. Yes, appreciate. Nice to meet you, David. Thank you for your presentation. My name is Stephen Snyder. I'm from Jamaica. I work for an NGO that helps young professionals learn about sustainable finance and leadership development. And my question was, Since your experience working with companies, where do you start? If they have no sustainability plan or no transition plan, what's the first document that you're sort of leading them towards in developing their own plans to make reporting happen, to make understanding of risk?
Yeah, so I think one of the really good starting points, and fortunately both the TCFD and the ISSB created these resource hubs, and the vision of those hubs is to really help the institutions to begin and get started. They have a number of these, what we call workshops in a box, with the idea of, okay, on governance, what are the questions we should be asking? We actually also at UNEP-FI have a forthcoming report on getting started on climate reporting. But really, when I'm working hand in hand with an organization and they haven't done anything, I think the first step is really getting people to think about what this issue is and why it matters. I think sometimes we start with the case study examples, and it's a big multinational bank, and they've been working on these reports for the last 6 years, and it's a 90-page report. And I think that can be very daunting for people, and they'll say, okay, well, we there's no way we can get there, so this is actually not as helpful for us. So often it's just getting people to start with the exercise of thinking through how climate might affect them, how there's a lot more diversity to the ways that it may impact them. And also, really, to me, one of the most fun parts of this kind of work that I get to do is learning from people, because a lot of times people have real local expertise. And so it's not for me to say, hey, let me tell you about your country's climate risks, or hey, let me tell you about your business's financial risks, but tell me about how you normally think about things. And I'm going to add some other items, some other suggestions to this list. And maybe from there, new things will come up for you. So how do we really facilitate that thinking process? To me, that is the first step kind of in the pre-writing phase. And then I think it's leveraging the resources that we've created at UNEP-FI. It's the resources from that TCFD and ISSB hub. But really, it's about getting started and then using case study examples from peers in very targeted ways. So rather than saying this is the end result, saying we're trying to think about what the right reporting structure is. Let's look at what that big institution did and how they set it up. That, to me, is, I think, the most effective way to use case studies. So I know a few different parts to your answer there, but I hope that kind of suggests some angles and areas to look at.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, David. I think that's a beautiful starting point, and those workshops are something I'll definitely look into. Thanks for mentioning that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you for that, Stephen. I see that Olivia has questions. She did put a couple of things in the chat section, but I don't know if you want to, it's a lot of stuff you put there. So perhaps you want to ask just a couple, and then we'll go to Elisa. I see Elisa's hand is up.
Hi, everyone. My name is Olivia. I'm from South Africa. Guys, thank you so much for the brilliant presentation so far. It's been lovely. It's very cool to be part of this cohort, so I appreciate that. I've dropped a whole lot of questions in here. Living in an emerging market, there are lots of difficulties, and I've written a couple of things about mitigation versus adaptation and political risk and exclusion lists. And I guess what I want to gain out of this is coming from an emerging market where most of our investors are international and everyone's saying no to carbon. I live in a country where our energy baseload has to be powered by fossil fuels. And the transition to renewable energy, it's being seriously hindered by the lack of finance going into our baseload, which is mining. And unless we have energy for mining, the entire grid will go down in South Africa. And if the grid goes down, it'll go down for more than a month, which means, given best stats, 16 million people will die. That's a huge percentage of our population. So for me, I guess it's not a specific question, but I wanted to bring the sort of emerging market aspect to it, which is how are we as different emerging markets going to handle exclusion lists, and also explain to emerging markets that there's a big difference between mitigation and adaptation. I live in a country where there is no space for mitigation. We can only adapt. We've been feeling the effects of climate change for ages. So it's so I've also put a question in here, something about communicating English to English. And what I meant by that was, how do you communicate, despite political risk and exclusion lists? How do we get money into the country so that we can facilitate a just energy transition using climate finance? So that's where I was going with all of these questions. And that communication is how to, emerging market to investors that are sitting in different countries, especially emerged markets. Because physical versus conceptual threats, if you haven't experienced it, it's very difficult to think about things from only an adaptation perspective. That's me, over and out.
No, great questions. And I think like this is why it's so important, and to be totally honest, why more young people as well as more people from emerging economies need to be part of the conversation, because I've been to so many events and so many conversations in Europe, in North America, and it's about, our net zero goals and going on. And I remember I was in Nairobi last year speaking with the governor of the Central Bank of Kenya, and he was asking, what do you think we should prioritize between mitigation and adaptation? And it's a no-brainer. It's adaptation. It is a clear and present impact on people's lives and livelihoods today. That said, I think there are steps that don't need to be oppositional to supporting mitigation over the longer term. Some of those come from assistance, so things like the JETP partnerships, the Just Energy Transitions Partnership, the idea of building some additional and increasing capacity for a distributed grid, so there is backup in case there is issues with energy in the future that creates less of a dependence on coal. The transition, this idea of just flipping a switch. There's so many smart people in financial markets. There's so many smart engineers, and on the technological side, we've seen remarkable progress. But if climate were as straightforward an issue as it looks on paper when it comes to emissions reductions, then I think we would really be in a very different situation. But the fact is, these thorny questions exist. And I think that the challenge to me is really making sure that we put in the right amount into supporting adaptation. And I think adaptation continues to be very underappreciated in the global economy, but also especially in the sense that on the mitigation side, I think we sort of have to really recognize what a just transition means. And it's not just about making sure, miners in Germany or in Poland or in West Virginia in the United States are provided for if their jobs go away, but really making sure that the level of difficulty of mitigation is balanced across the board. And what it means scientifically is net zero by 2050 doesn't mean we all do the same thing. It means some need to do more, some need to move faster, some need to provide funding to catalyze the actions of others. But I think these are some of the key questions to me that have to be had. And on climate change at COP28, I don't think the topic anymore is about, should we respond to climate change? What should our goals be? We know what all of those things are. I think what we really need to be doing now, what we need to be really driving, is this process and practice of getting the systems in place that will help people all move faster, rather than focusing, simply on our own narrow focus. Because science never said that, Barclays needs to get to net zero. Science never said that the United Kingdom needs to get to net zero. Science said that the planet needs to reach net zero. And that may mean that in certain countries, certain contexts, things need to move faster. But I think your point about adaptation is very well taken, and is something where this to me also really comes to this question of reimagining the international financial institutions, such as the World Bank, such as the IMF. How can they play a role that doesn't increase indebtedness, but actually plays a role in really creating the systems and structures that brings private finance into the mix? Because right now we're not really seeing that happen, or at least not at the levels needed.
Okay, David, thank you so much for that. Olivia, I hope you responded to your question, because for me, It was great, but did I respond to your question? Fantastic. I personally have a question, David, and I think I should just say, because it's a bit connected to Olivia's, being that we're also, within Africa. I'm based in Nigeria, and one thing is paramount, the fact that enough climate financing is not coming into the developing countries where a huge part of future, carbon emissions are expected to rise from, right? And so therefore we definitely need some form of a larger level of climate financing coming into, the continent, which we are not seeing. And the thing is, quite a number of about 22 of the African countries are heavily indebted. And so we are saddled with which is of more priority to us, respond to our debt situation or, refocus to adaptation mechanisms with the little financing or, capital creation that each country has. And so you see that there's that imbalance. And then this becomes my question. What role can the debt to nature financing swap play in this regard? Do you think is one solution, or what solutions would you prefer for us? Me speaking from the African context, we definitely have other regions that are also going through this.
Yeah, I think debt for nature can be really, really positive and really valuable, because what it can help to do when done in the right way that respects human rights, that doesn't create other issues of economic disruption, it can really help to monetize and bring the benefits that preserving nature bring to everyone around the world, to countries that may be very resource rich, but may not necessarily have the capital for extraction, and maybe at this point in time in a place where further extraction is not actually what we want. What we want is preservation and restoration. And so I think it can be a really powerful thing to consider. The other part of it, and this is, a little bit of, why I do work with the United Nations, is this is really, as I've said, a global challenge. And the ideal case would be if you imagine any of the countries that you're from, there are different subunits, whether those are states, provinces, districts, but there is some level of centralization, and that centralization helps to make sure that the most agricultural region, perhaps that is the smallest in gross domestic product, receives, benefits because people, of course, need food. So they're providing an essential service, maybe that isn't captured by the market. In other cases, areas where they're more prone to disasters, more funding is going there. So that's what happens in a kind of centralized system. What we have right now is, because of the international regime that really was created over the last couple hundred years, we have these borders, and in a lot of ways, they really show once again that climate change doesn't care about those borders, neither does an energy transition. And so as a result, what these things like debt for nature are trying to do are trying in a perhaps less direct way than, what a central authority could do. Maybe that's a pipe dream to have a central authority, but it's to say that a central authority would be helping to solve this problem, which is a global problem on a global scale. Whereas what we have instead are sort of elements like carbon credits, carbon markets that are trying to do that, but sort of through the back door. So again, I think it's a really important thing, because the other 2 points that I would make are, one, if you're going to increase spending on adaptation, you're going to increase spending on greening your grid. Now, especially as interest rates are higher, this is going to have a higher cost, and it will have an even higher cost in emerging economies. So if we're going to avoid unsustainable debt levels, if we're going to avoid countries trying to undertake austerity and cutting basic services when people need them most, I think we're going to really need to offer things that can create a global market. And those things are going to be, okay, well, we have something of value for you, but also for the planet. And I think that's a place where many of the creditor nations can really begin to see, hey, this isn't just a write-off. We're not writing off the debt and saying that it's lost. We're saying that we're actually instead properly valuing an asset that we haven't previously valued, which is, the role of nature. So I think it can be really powerful when done well. I haven't yet seen it done at the scale that will really drive major change at the global or even at the country level. But I think the theoretical framework behind it has a lot of value, just given the world that we live in, where we don't have that centralizing authority to drive change.
Okay, thank you so much, David, for that. I would like Elisa to quickly ask her question, and then I'll take the questions that people put in the group chat. We have about 10 minutes to wrap this up and allow David. Thank you, Elisa. Just make your question.
Okay, so thank you very much for the time, and thank you also, David, for your interesting presentation. So I'm a consultant at KPMG in Italy, and I help both companies and financial institutions in setting climate targets. And there's a question that has been haunting me for some time. And so I've seen that the financial institutions are increasingly using the emission data that are directly disclosed by the companies as the best data they can have. But working with the companies in computing that emission data, I've seen that there are a lot of differences in the way that different companies in the same sectors do that calculation. So, for example, there are I don't know, for example, in the fashion industry, I've seen that there are some average emission factors that refer to the same thing, but from a database to another. I've seen differences of 2 or 3 times. It's very difficult to compare the data that are disclosed by different companies, since they actually are computed with different values that don't speak to each other. So why the various institutions like TCFD or IFRAG and so on aren't planning to build some kind of database to be used, the database of average emission factors to be used by everyone. So I know that. So it's impossible to put in that all the emission factors, but at least for some high emitting sectors and for the emission factors that are mostly used by all the companies, so the emission factors for energy, electricity, and so on.
So this is a great question and a really important one as well, which is to say emissions data is not perfect. And in fact, in many cases, it is incomplete. In many cases, it lacks attestation or validation. And in many cases, it's given to restatement. And sometimes that is on account of how it's reported. Other times it's on account of how it's aggregated. And other times it's just the fact that the science itself around what activities create which emissions is shifting. So I think that one of the big efforts underway, and I've been involved in it, was around the work of the Greenhouse Gas Protocol in helping to specify how emissions should be cataloged and reported. There's also work on the financed emission side by PCAF, the Partnership for Carbon Accounting Financials, and they have what are called data quality scores. And I think that that's a really helpful way, a mixture of kind of qualitative and quantitative, for you to think a little bit about what the specific things are that are really going into adding to that uncertainty. So what I would say about emissions is, I think in some cases, people are a little bit, like to use that phrase, a dog with a bone when it comes to emissions. Everything is going to be, explained by emissions. This company is better than that. And in that case, we lose the full picture. We forget, the forest for the trees. We forget all of the other elements. And so I think emissions are important, and we need to, and in fact, from a legal and regulatory perspective, we need to demand having accurate and improving emissions data. That's one of the ways we can validate commitments that are made, but it can't be the only source of information. And so for, say, an energy provider, their emissions footprint is a big element, but so is the percentage of generation so is the percentage of revenue coming from green sources versus fossil sources, so is the overall shift in investment going forward into new assets. And so we still, can't, as much as we love to simplify the world down, we can't just think in one way. So I think those resources I mentioned, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, the Partnership for Carbon Accounting Financials, are important guidance areas. But I think work also is underway, not only on creating some of the potential standards, but also recognizing that we may always have uncertainty, even in the same way that we do with financial statements. It's not that every piece of information is going to be identical and unchanging, but we know, one, emissions data needs to get better than it is. Two, it's only part of the picture. And three, we need to be integrating it into our decision-making process in order, one, to create the demand signal, because if nobody uses the emissions data, then it just becomes, well, why spend the time, money, and effort to report it? So that's really where regulation comes in, but that's also really where market users come in to help, improve and drive that forward.
Thank you. Let me just quickly, we have a lot of questions and I'm certain that our time would not permit, but I'll just take a few questions. Although there's one from someone in Pakistan who says that that they are heavily impacted by climate change and all of that, but then they're not getting the necessary financial aid that they expect. He was asking for the reason, but I'll just go to Lucy Redwood's question. She says, when you talk about transition risks, to what extent does advice to companies incorporate social risks into this? For example, when you talk about stranded assets, does this also acknowledge the people that lose their livelihoods as a result of the transition? Do you think this is incorporated enough into corporate risk assessment, or is this seen as the responsibility of government? Just to add to what Lucy also said, the fact that there's also the question of what we're trying to transition, there are definitely people, particularly those within the lower end of the pyramid, those in developing countries, that are heavily impacted, David?
Yeah. So the frustrating answer there is that not enough is really being done and considered on the social issues. I think this is one of the big reasons why, for example, in the EU, in complement to the green taxonomy, the social taxonomy is under development there. It's one of the reasons we at UNEP-FI created a specific position for a colleague of mine to really lead some of our social impact work. And so the areas around the just transition do need to be considered. So I've talked about just transition in two ways right now. I've talked about it first, about making sure those who are displaced by the transition are adequately supported. Second, really concerning what is just in terms of commitments. So I've mentioned those, but I'll mention a third right now, which is to ensure that the actions and activities we're doing are just as well, meaning that we don't contravene human rights. We don't kick people, especially indigenous communities, off their land in order to preserve a forest that they are doing a perfectly good job preserving. Or similarly, that we don't use exploitative labor practices to produce raw materials that are necessary for things such as solar panels, electric batteries, and others. And so realizing that these two things can't be separated, I think, is especially key. That, I think, is some of the good work that is being done. Both, somebody mentioned EFRAG before, the European Financial Reporting Advisory Group, as well as from the ISSB in their more general ESG standard. They talk about this because a solution that is going to be a climate solution that fails on nature or fails on social issues is really going to fall short of being the right solution. And so I think that is, to my mind, where these considerations need to be. Are they in some cases integrated? Yes, because some companies, some businesses have specific provisions, say against unsustainable palm oil, against child labor. But to the extent that people really are looking at their supply chains, I think this is an area where more effort and more focus needs to be given, because while we've gotten direct elements of social policy to take place. I think once it goes up the supply chain or down the supply chain, we realize that we actually don't necessarily have that visibility. And I would argue cynically, in some cases, companies don't necessarily want to know. And I think that's where regulation, but also where public pressure to need to know and need to be responsible has to come in.
Okay, thank you so much, David, for that. Redwood, I hope that response answers your question. Okay, so we basically have 1 minute. I don't know if you can take one more question during that because our next facilitator is here. Perhaps I'll just take from Karghoo. Karghoo says, are there plans to integrate the TNFD with the TCFD? As biodiversity and ecosystem services also affect climate risks and companies often harm the ecosystem health.
Yeah, yeah, let me speak about TNFD. I'm just because I saw Stephen's question, I want to just reiterate my 3 points on just transition. It's addressing the displacement of jobs. It's ensuring that the commitments made across countries and regions are fair relative to their levels of development and to their financial resources. And then finally, it is ensuring that the actions we take to get to net zero are themselves just. So I'm not saying that that's a universal framework, that's a David framework, but hopefully that's a helpful way to think about it. So just quickly on that, back to TNFD, what I would say on that is there aren't necessarily plans to integrate the two of them, but the TNFD has been heavily informed. And as I've been involved in helping to develop and draft it, it has really been heavily informed by the work of the TCFD. So those who are less aware, TNFD is the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures. And the aim there really is to think more expansively. Of course, climate change is a nature-related issue. And so the expectation is many of these same elements apply. And indeed, when we look at the TCFD and the TNFD, we see that what they have in common are those 4 pillars: governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics and targets. So the idea, I think, ultimately will be for people to produce comprehensive environmental and sustainability reporting with the idea that climate is a particular issue of interest today, but shouldn't be seen in isolation. So while there isn't a plan explicitly to merge the two of them, they definitely are conceptually and structurally strongly linked. So with that, maybe I'll hand back to you, Irene. What I would say is I see a lot of questions that unfortunately I don't think we will have time to answer here. If you don't mind, because you'll have the transcript, just sharing those with me, and then I'm very happy over the next couple of weeks to get back to those. So if people want to send those, I'll work with my team just to make sure that nobody feels like they've missed out.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, David, for your time. And yes, we actually have someone on standby taking all the questions, putting them together. So we'll send them via email to you, and we'll be very happy to get the responses from yourself and your team, which we definitely share with the participants on the call today. Thank you so much once again for your time. For everyone who did enjoy David Carlin's session as I did, please just an emoji of a celebratory, whatever celebratory emoji for David. Thank you so much. For those of us whose videos are on, our hands are clapping. Thank you so much, David. We are grateful. By the way, David had to take a short break from his vacation just to be with us. So that's a lot of sacrifice. Thank you. Thank you, David.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Well, I hope you enjoyed it, and looking forward to more conversations soon. But obviously, this is a great program you've set up, and I'm excited Absolutely. To see more knowledge come out of it, and more inspiration for those who are in this cohort.
So I don't know, just in case before you run off, there was the bit of, what the kinds of paper, journals, and code that you like to see by the time we're done with this entire program. Do you just want to speak a bit about it so that those people on the call can start to think around it?
Yeah, so one thing I was thinking, and we can obviously speak a bit more about this, and I also don't want to delay your next session unnecessarily, but what I was thinking was many of you have really interesting and important roles in very diverse organizations. And what I think could be super valuable is to think about how we could do a little bit of kind of mini case studies, and they can be anonymized in case you're, uncomfortable about the potential way in which, you or the organization may be reflected, but really trying to take pieces of this sustainability and in particular this climate challenge and see kind of what tools you have at your disposal, what work, because what I could almost imagine is an anthology of how to drive action in different places. Okay, from a law firm perspective, here's a pro bono project we worked on. From a company perspective, here's something we did in our supply chain. From a risk management perspective, here's something we did in evaluating these things. I think that could be really useful as a peer guide across the board, because so often what I see my role as is really just facilitating those conversations and facilitating the sharing of experiences. And in some ways, my own personal role here is to consolidate a lot of that and to share it back with people like you. So I think that could be one really interesting thing for us to begin thinking about. Maybe we have some people do that or have shortened versions. We can give some structure to what those could contain and what use cases we might want to cover. But I think really showing the diversity of ways to act and be involved, from the direct activism as part of an NGO to the working within an organization to promote sustainability in their operations, to helping to change the financial system, to being involved in policy, to working legally. So really there's, I think, so many things we can do. And that's, I think, the benefit of having a group. So anyway, would love to explore that more with the organizers, Irene, with you, with everyone else, but maybe just to get everyone to start thinking there.
Thank you so much, David. We can then allow you run off to the rest of your vacation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Irene.
Our next facilitator is here now, Alexandra, climate journalist based in Mauritius. Is he here, Karishma?
Yeah.
Oh, yes, I see you. Hi. Our
Hello.
next facilitator is here. Thank you so much for joining us. I already shared I hope we are all on the WhatsApp group, because I shared his slides with us, Alexandra's slides. I did share with us. Please, you can check your WhatsApp group chat. So would you like to project your screen? So we give you permission to share.
Okay. Let me try.
All right, great. While I just read your bio to our participants.
Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can see your screen.
And can you hear me? There's a fan not far, and I'd like to ensure that you hear me well.
Yes, we can hear you loud and clear.
Okay.
Yes,
Great.
we can hear you.
Before starting, could someone just tell me a bit, who am I talking to right now? How many of you are in maybe
Okay, so we're actually we're 72 on the call.
Yeah.
A mixture of some are students, some are workers, some are interns. So it's a blend of all.
Okay. So hello everyone. I'm Alexandre from Mauritius. So it's 3 p.m. here. I'm a business journalist. Sorry, Irene, I introduce myself if you don't mind, since I've already started.
Yes, please go on.
Yes, so I'm a business journalist. So thank you for having me. I'm here only to share with you some of the experience I've gathered, some of the insights I've had. So I write and speak mostly in French, so bear with me for my English. So if ever there's need of precision, don't hesitate to interrupt me and ask questions. Let's move. So I'm 20 years old. I'm married. I have some experience in education. I worked as a teacher for a few, let's say, months in a high school, but I've been mostly a business journalist for almost 4 years now. So I have a degree in politics and international relations. So during my studies, I worked as a teacher, teaching mainly French, a bit of English to small classes, and science. Then I studied politics and international relations in Mauritius, but with University of London. So I have a degree from LSE. And after my studies, I worked for a magazine called L'Echo Austral, which is the oldest regional business magazine of the Indian Ocean. That is, it's 30 years old, and it's kind of a unique magazine. It's present in Mauritius, Réunion, and Madagascar. But now I work for Le Journal des Archipels, which is a new business magazine, which has been around for almost 2 years, for more than 2 years now. We launched in 2021, which is quite, I think, courageous after COVID, because it is a magazine in print. So I'm responsible of a Mauritian part of the magazine, because Le Journal des Archipels is also a regional magazine. We are in Mauritius, Réunion Island, Madagascar, Comoros, Mayotte. And we're published in all these countries, and also in the south of France since last year. So myself, I specialize in digitalization and fintech. But since I joined Le Journal des Archipels, I'm specializing, I'd say, in sustainable development. And last year, I joined the Oxford Climate Journalism Network, which is quite new. I think it's less than 2 years old. So it's a network. A network from the University of London and the Reuters Institute. So who trains hundreds of journalists on climate-related questions and about climate reporting. So just a few words about my magazine, because I think it's important to what I'm going to say. So already said we are 2 years old. We are published every 2 months. In Mauritius, I don't know if everyone knows where Mauritius is. Réunion, Madagascar, and Comoros. We are a magazine, as I said already. We have a website and a weekly newsletter. And what do we publish about? What do we write about? It's economy and environment in the Indian Ocean. What does this mean? We focus on circular economy. Sorry, I made a mistake here. I meant to write blue economy, green economy, and sustainable development. Okay, so circular economy, I think you're quite familiar with what it is. So it's promoting a sustainable way of doing business. That is, you generate as little as possible waste, or you use maximum of your waste as resources for other industries. Okay, so we try as a business magazine to report about what businesses are doing in their operations or in their plans to shift their model, because in the region, it is something that really makes sense, this concept of circular economy, that is really reducing the amount of waste you produce. And if ever you produce inevitable waste, make sure that this waste can be transformed. Why? Because we are islands. Sorry. Mauritius, like Réunion, like Madagascar and Comoros, we are islands. Madagascar is a big one, but we're small islands. And we have direct consequences of mismanagement of waste. That is, Mauritius, we have only one landfill. I think the word is landfill, and it's already saturated. Okay, so now we are digging to make more room for our waste. So it makes sense for all our islands to really think about how to make things more circular, reduce our waste, and make sure that we can use it again as a resource. So just to show a bit what we look like. Okay, so we talk a lot about businesses, but a lot also about the ocean, about the environment, about biodiversity. What I've shown is that we made an investigation about about overfishing in the Indian Ocean, which was, I received an award for this, a grant, sorry, for this investigation. So this is the kind of things we try to do, investigating what is happening in the Indian Ocean in terms of the environment. So there's a big issue of overfishing tuna in the Indian Ocean. So we had an idea, we pitched it, and we were given a grant for this. It was published about 3 months ago, and in a few days I published it online. So just to show how a business magazine writes about the environment. Okay, so also I wrote, if you see at the bottom of the page, about pesticides. So there was 2 years ago a report from the FAO who said that Mauritius was the biggest user of pesticides in the world. Okay, so we talked about it during the pandemic because that's when we heard about it, but it's not true. So in an inquiry, I revealed that it's not true, that it was in fact a mistake, and I explained how this mistake came about. So just to show you how a business magazine talk about the environment, preserving the biodiversity. And on the screen, you have a story about how Charles Darwin in Mauritius helped to preserve a species of tortoise from Seychelles by bringing it in Mauritius. So that's what we do. So before saying what I have to say about how I do climate reporting, I must first say what is business journalism, because I'm not sure if you're all familiar with it. So journalists should be, what we work with is not only information, it's not only news. Journalists work with constraints. That is, I often say I'm not a journalist like other journalists in Mauritius, because I work for a publication that is published every 2 months. So I can't write like a journalist who has to write every day about businesses. That's what I mean by this. We have to manage constraints. So as a business journalist for a magazine published every 2 months, my way of working is very different from a journalist, a business journalist working for a daily newspaper. It's almost not the same job. I mean, if I was a business journalist working for a daily newspaper, probably I couldn't be here talking to you, because I would have to go attend conferences, have maybe to write 1, 2, 3 articles per day, send it to my editor, and do it every day. But since I'm a business journalist for a magazine, a specialized one, the way I work is different. So I have constraints on how I work. For example, if there's an announcement today from let's say the Ministry of Environment, almost everyone will have heard about it when they get my magazine. So if I write about something that I think is newsworthy, I should really contextualize the news. I should really dig deeper and show where this news is coming from. Okay, for instance, if I write about a company, because I work mostly with private entities, that is companies, if a company announces something, anything, like let's say about, to give an easy example, it's they are investing in electric mobility, electric transport, okay? I have to explain to my readers who will read about it in a few weeks why it makes sense business-wise, why this company, which was doing something else, is doing this today. Maybe for electric vehicles, the government has put in place a lot of incentives to do that. Maybe I have to write about why it's easier to have electric cars in Mauritius than in Europe, because we have a small country, so it totally makes sense to have electric cars, because you don't have the issue that you have in other big countries like France and England of not having enough charging stations. It's not an issue in Mauritius, because you can hardly, if you travel for 3 hours in Mauritius, you have traveled the whole country. Okay, so it's not an issue. So when I write about electric mobility, I say that it's easier for Mauritians to adopt electric cars. It's easier for us than Europeans, for instance. Okay, so the way you work as a business journalist is really particular, because you just can't only report about the news you just had today. You have to really contextualize everything, even more if you work for a publication like mine. Okay, you also have to cater for the resources that you have. Okay, I just told you I wrote an 8-page investigation about overfishing in the Indian Ocean, but haven't I received a grant, I couldn't have done it, because if my magazine is 100 page, and I write about 30 to 35 pages of this magazine. So if we don't have more resources to do this, we can't do this kind of investigation, because sometimes people tell me, why don't I report about X, Y, or Z subject? It's simply because you don't have resources, the time or the space in the magazine to do it, or you don't have enough people with expertise to do it. Okay, why it's relevant? Because from what I've gathered, maybe some of you might be interested in doing this kind of thing, maybe business journalists or climate journalists. You should really be aware of who is your audience, who are you writing for. Okay, you can have an expertise maybe in carbon footprint and all that, but your audience does not understand it, and you should make sure that people who read you understand what you're saying, because there's a temptation for us business journalists. It's doing a lot of infographics, a lot of data, a lot of stats, but you should really understand that most of your readers are not very good in, well, I won't say in stats, but in maths. So you have to write in a way that it makes sense for them. So even if I write a lot about sustainable development, about carbon footprint, I rarely use carbon emissions in my text. I don't say there's been a reduction of so much tons of CO2, because unfortunately, that's a reality. Most people don't understand what it is, and it's not relevant for you to do that. It takes a lot of time and resources to do it. So that's what I wanted to say about business journalism. Let me move quickly about what is climate reporting as a business journalist. So here are photos of a book published by the Indian Ocean Commission. So these are photos from Mauritius or Madagascar. okay, about the impact of climate change on our islands. The thing is, I think I told that to Karishma a few days ago. I had the chance to talk to other journalists from Europe or US maybe, or even India. And what I've come to realize is that they have much more resources that we do. That is, there's a lot more publications about the impact of climate change on their countries than there are on ours, okay? We have reports, IPCC reports, for instance, that give a list of maybe vulnerable countries, what will be effects on Mauritius, but you don't have news every week or every month that you can write about for Mauritius, for Réunion, for Madagascar, because most of the research done is not done in Mauritius, is not done in Madagascar. So you have very limited scientific paper that you can get directly from Mauritius. You will get it from European sources, and the issue is with that is that there's no point for us writing about it again, because most of the time the big media outlets will have already talked about it. So for me, a business journalist, I don't report about the impact of climate change on Mauritius or Madagascar or Réunion. What I do write about is how businesses in Mauritius, in Réunion Island, in Madagascar, in the Indian Ocean, or in Africa, because we also cover Africa sometimes, how do they adapt their strategy to due to climate change? Let me give you an example. Mauritius, we have a very big tourism sector. We have a lot of hotels and resorts because we have 1.3 million Mauritians and about 1.3 million before COVID tourists who came. So we are already, I think from last year, about 1 million tourists. So maybe by next year or maybe this year, we'll have 1.3 million tourists who will have come to Mauritius. So there's a big tourism sector. And how do they adapt to climate change? They won't work a lot on reducing their carbon footprint, because like I say, even if Mauritius became carbon neutral by tomorrow, it won't change a lot. We would still be very vulnerable to climate change. So what's the priority for most businesses is making sure that they are sustainable, that is, they can continue to make business, to operate, even if there's climate change, even if the world is changing. So what does it mean for the tourism sector? That is, some Mauritian hotels, for example, have pledged not to avoid importing food from countries who are far from Mauritius. For instance, we don't serve salmon. We serve only fish that is fished from locally in Mauritius or in the Indian Ocean. We buy their vegetables and fruits from only nearby planters and producers. This is what I report about, how businesses change the way they work to adapt to the new reality that climate change is creating. That's what it means for me as a business journalist in Mauritius to write about climate. It's not very fancy because I talk to a lot of journalists who are maybe in France, in Europe, who have a chance to really specialize on climate and really go on field and see the impact of climate change on maybe biodiversity, on crops and all that. But we are in Mauritius, small country, we don't have data available. And we are a small publication, a unique one. So it's very hard for us to do this kind of specialized reporting. And why I was focusing on what is business journalism before is that even if we did, I don't think we'd have the audience in Mauritius, because it's already hard for us to find an audience in the Indian Ocean. We publish only 6,000 copies of our magazine, which is not a lot maybe for you where you're from, but for us it's a lot because it covers the whole of the Indian Ocean. It's for Mauritius, Réunion, Madagascar, Comoros. So if we reported only on climate, I don't think we'd have the audience. Okay, I know we don't have a lot of time. I try to be short. So how do I write about green, sustainable, or climate finance? Because it's a topic I think it's important to talk about. The thing is, I wrote about it maybe 3 years ago, and I come to realize 3 things. Firstly, there's a real ambiguity on the terms. That's why I've put all 3: green, sustainable, and climate finance. Because when you see the word green finance, you understand that it's for the environment, it's for maybe reducing your carbon emissions and all that. But in the business community, what you'll see is that, for instance, banks prefer to use the word sustainable finance. And very often you'll use the words interchangeably. That is, you'll use either one or the other. But the thing is that in a lot of cases, you realize that if a bank is using the word sustainable, it's because it allows to encompass in it other things other than impact on the environment. For instance, if a financial solution has an impact on the social environment, for instance, or yes, on the social environment, they say it's sustainable. Okay, maybe they are investing in an industry that is detrimental on the environment because they are exploiting resources. There's an issue of using more water, more energy, and more natural resources. But they'll brand it as sustainable because maybe it has a positive impact on the community. That is, jobs are being created and all that. So it is something that is very hard to work with, because you should be very cautious about how organizations, how businesses are reporting about it. So I just wanted to give you some advices. Talk to people who are experts in this field. So I had a chance last year to talk about to Karishma. I think you know who she is. Karishma, who was studying climate finance. So I found someone, she's a young Mauritian like myself, and we talk about the subject. What does it mean? What are not the regulations, but maybe when can we say that something is really green or climate finance? Okay, you ask these 3 questions because what you realize is that a lot of businesses use these words, sometimes even important organizations, without really defining those terms. And when you are reporting without being cautious about how you're using those words, you're helping them doing sometimes greenwashing. You're helping them making readers even more confused, and you're not helping anyone. Okay, so an advice I always give when you write about these technical subjects, because it's a mixture of sustainability, of finance and climate. You are a journalist, maybe I am a journalist. I don't have the expertise. I should find one or two persons who are independent, who are credible, and who can guide you in writing your article. So that's what I've done. I've put the issue, the first page of the issue we made in April 2021 about green finance. So it's the first time, in fact, that in Mauritius someone wrote about green finance that much. So I wrote about green bonds. What is it? The new framework that the central bank has put in place. And just to say that the reason that it's the first time that a journalist has done it is that it's very complicated for us journalists to do it. So I had the chance that my editor gave me the time and resource to interview about 5 persons to really understand what it is and say how in Mauritius it's relevant, because green finance means something else if you are in Mauritius. It means something else if you are in Africa. It means something else if you are in France, because the priorities are different. And whenever you write about these kind of subjects, you should really say what is the relevance for your country or for your an industry. Okay, and like I said, for Mauritius, sustainable finance, green finance should be geared mostly towards adaptation. It doesn't make a lot of sense to work on attenuation, unfortunately. Yes, we should work on it. If we can, we should reduce our carbon footprint. But for Mauritius, the green finance we need, and which is hard to get, is a finance that will help us, I mean the country and its inhabitants and its businesses, to adapt to climate change and therefore be sustainable. That's what I wanted to say. And just to give you an example, a case study, how to write about COP from when you're in Mauritius. It's a very big event, okay? When you're writing about climate, and when you're writing about sustainability, like I do. But the thing is, we are not there. Mauritian journalists are not there. We are not invited. We don't have a chance to accompany the Mauritian delegations. So the news that we get about what's going on from the COP comes from other media outlets. Okay, so it's really important to understand that. So what happens in countries like Mauritius, like Madagascar, is that since journalists are not there, they get information from other media outlets who are the one who say what is relevant or not. So what you'll see if you listen to France 24, BBC, and all these kind of big giant media organizations, they will talk about what are big countries like China, the US, the UK, India, what are they doing? And then in Mauritius, you get this information from these organizations, or sometimes you go on their website and you just report what other media outlets have reported. But there's an issue with that. Again, at a COP conference, what's relevant for Mauritius is how are we going to fund our transition. That is, Mauritius has pledged to shift 60% of the electric grid to renewable sources. Okay, that is, we want to produce 60% of our electricity from renewable sources by 2030. Okay, it has been announced, I think, 2 years ago or 1 year ago. But the issue is we don't know how to finance that. And when we report about COP in Mauritius, we don't talk about these subjects because journalists are not trained to understand how these conferences work, and more importantly, we are not there. We are not seeing how negotiations are done. And from what I've gathered, Mauritius doesn't have really a voice in such conferences. So I like to give this example of COP because when you're reading international outlets, it's really a big thing. But when you come to Mauritius, you realize that we don't talk about the COP in Mauritius because you don't see how relevant it is for Mauritius because we're not there. And the information we get comes from other journalists who are not concerned by Mauritius and don't, so they don't make how do you say that? Say what is really important for Mauritius. So that's really kind of a funny situation because, you know, when I talk to other journalists from abroad, I've had the chance to talk with journalists from Kenya, from Mozambique, and all that, and to when I tell them how difficult it is for us to report out these things because we don't find the information, it's quite funny. It's sad, but it's the reality because we don't have the information firsthand, and that's an issue. So you'll see in Mauritius, most media outlets won't report about conferences like COP because we're not there. And as a business journalist, what I've come to realize is that businesses don't have a voice too. So since businesses are not involved in the discussion, in the notion, so as a business journalist, I don't feel the urge to write about the COP because businesses are not involved. It's a discussion between states, and my readers who are mostly entrepreneurs don't feel like reading about it. So I end here. So thank you for listening to me. Sorry, I tried to be as quick as possible and try to be as relevant as possible, but as I said, English is not my first my mother tongue. So if you have any questions, I'd be glad to answer to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alexandra. Is this still on the call?
Yes.
Okay, thank you so much for your presentation. It was great listening to you, and I mean, while we are a pool of different sets of, participants on the call, coming from the angle of a journalist, for example, it then becomes clear how best to reports on climate financing. I know that there are some people here who are in the private sector, some from the public sector, some are actually students and all of that. But it's also important that when we talk about climate financing, you are able to communicate it to the next person in such a way that he or she understands. As a participant of this call, while you are also trying to, garner expertise, understanding on the concept, the question you should be asking yourself is, when somebody comes to you tomorrow or later today and says, oh, I heard about carbon credits, can you explain it to me? Are you able to break it down in such a way that they understand so that it doesn't sound like gibberish to them? I liked how you said, oh, there are certain terminologies that you may want to sort of break down even when you're writing an article, because sometimes we are carried away by how sleek we want our writing to be, the perception we want our audience to have of us. But the truth is, I remember talking to a climate journalist. Yes, she does write, she does climate reporting, but her focus is mainly on how it impacts on human lives and then the environment. And then I was talking about climate finance and all of that. And she says to me, Irene, I try to avoid the bit of climate finance because I think it's too technical. So the question becomes, as an expert or a growing expert in the conversations regarding climate finance, are you able to communicate it effectively to those who perhaps may not even have any understanding whatsoever what the topic is about? And I'm grateful that Alexandra was able to sort of help us see how, from his own point of view, from his role as a journalist, working from Mauritius, how he has been able to sort of surmount this challenge. It's also beautiful to see that your publication, you're not in, there's no rat chasing on having to publish 3 articles per day, 4 articles. So this now helps you, build on the quality of work that you're having to present. And it'll be great to see more of us who are on this call attempt writing things regarding climate finance. It could even be on the session that we had today. A lot of us shared our LinkedIn posts. When you are communicating to your LinkedIn community, right, that, oh, you took on this training, do you just want to inundate everybody with the technical jargon, or you want them to understand the fact? Because guess what? How some people interpret your level of understanding of whatever it is you claim to understand is how you're able to explain it to a 5-year-old, not how you're able to explain it to the experts themselves. So one of your aims should be, oh, if I'm able to explain it to a 5-year-old, then I actually understand the concept of climate financing. I know that one person had, one of the participants, when we just started the call, talked about how they go to schools and then they try to explain to students conversations about climate change and all of that. So that should really be one of our focus areas, your ability to explain these things to schools. And that's actually one of our projects after this training, to go, because some of us would then be deciding, oh, we want to go do some sessions with students in our community, help them understand the concept of climate finance. Everybody is trying to run towards the easy part of environmental sustainability, how to upcycle or recycle things. But what about the part that has to do with, bringing in the monies into our countries to conduct certain projects? David Carlin, during his session, if you remember, talked about how, oh yes, for example, in Africa, we have an abundance of natural resources, but perhaps we do not have the capital to then convert these things into value add for the people. How are you able to explain this to those who you would meet along the line? Thank you so much once again, Alexandra. I don't know if anybody has any questions or any contributions. Karishma?
Yes, so I see no questions. Thanks, Alexandre, for intervening. I think it was very helpful, especially to know the struggles from the global south, and especially islanders, how they navigate this system. And whatever Alexandre shared through this session is very much relevant, because most of us, you asked the question, we are from 90 countries, more than 90 countries actually in this academy. And we have a very good representation from developing countries and islands as well, even from the Caribbean. They are very strong presence and interactions there, so they can relate to what they're saying. Answering some questions maybe to Stephen about Mauritius, because I'm from Mauritius as well. The power that Mauritius can have at the UN as a voting member is usually, you would see that we have groups. So there is a group for seats, and Mauritius sits in 2 groups when the lobbying comes. So it sits in seats group and the African negotiators group. So over there, no country usually, especially islands or at least developing countries, we don't go alone to lobby or advocate. We go in terms of those groups. Now the big questions remain is about how much of this communication goes to the resident the citizens, or even like the general public, about what the country is doing itself. That's like where Alexandre was trying to say this is the main gap, because what we know is happening on the international platform, but when you're back there in your country, you don't get this information. So maybe us, when we are But you guys, when you are very much active on international platforms as well, you should be sharing more communication like this. But as Irene mentioned, be mindful about how these communications are going out and the jargons that you're using so that it's understood by the general audience as well. And second thing I would say is to amplify your voice and to make out as many communications as possible. For example, reach out to people like Alexandre in your own country, business journalists that can report about what you're doing on your professional space or even like in your advocacy space, because this is very important to showcase your presence and to increase this knowledge and awareness on climate financing. So this is why we invited like a business journalist, for you to know that when you are reporting and when you are communicating, what does it take? It's not just like writing an article and say, hey, you should publish my article, but there would be fact checking, there would be meetings. I know you would meet up, we would have calls with the journalists to understand what are your perspectives. It takes a lot. It's not just about writing and then publishing. So this was the idea behind, because this is a reporting academy. Though we can't do more on the public policy making side or private sector side, but you can start now by digging into ways that you could do it through the communications in journalism. So that's a bit from my side. We'll listen through some questions that you might have as well. I have see questions, Irene, in the chat if you want to take it.
Yes, so I see a question from Olivia. Olivia from South Africa. She says, what online platforms are most useful for communicating climate finance education?
If I may, the issue I really have with climate finance, I was asked recently by an international organization to write about how I write about sustainable finance. I have a really big issue with this, because like I said, there's an issue with a term we use. What do we mean by that? Let me give you an example. In Mauritius, you have a foreign aid agency who has a line of credit, a green line of credit, but that is money loaned to companies through banks. Okay. The issue is that they say it's green finance, but at the end of the day, they don't say at the end of the line of credit, that is when, for instance, they have 100 million euros loaned, they can't say what has been the impact of these 100 million on the environment. Okay. So it's kind of tricky, because you talk about sustainable finance, but at the end of the day, has the impact been really good? Let me give you another example. Last year, Mauritius had for the first time a framework for green bonds. So we have typical bonds, and now we have a framework for green bonds. Okay. But the framework says, okay, for something to be labeled green bond, it should be money that will be used for X, Y, Z, and one of it is electrical cars, like I said earlier. But the issue today is that only 20% of our electricity comes from renewable energy. Okay, out of it, out of a 20%, 13% is from bagasse, that is sugarcane. Okay, sugarcane that is burnt. So today, if you change every thermal car from Mauritius to an electric car, in fact, you're emitting more carbon. Okay, if with the same electric grid, the same amount of electricity from renewable sources that we use now, if you shift cars from thermal to electric, the carbon footprint of cars in Mauritius increases. So how can we say that it is green or sustainable finance? So it's very hard to report about these things. So what I try to do as a business journalist, when I have a news, I say, organization X has launched a new service, a new product. What is it? What are the objectives? I explain it. And then I try to find an expert, an independent one, that is someone which is reliable, not someone from the company, but can explain to me how green, how sustainable really the product is. And I just report it, because there's something I insist upon, is that journalists are not here to say what should be. We are here to say what is. If something is labeled green finance, okay, we can say it's labeled green finance, but we should also say that it's not, this might not be true, and why, okay? But we don't point fingers. I don't like this. I don't like to point fingers to organizations and say what you're lying and all that. No, I just say organizations X launch this product, but what they say, and organization Y or expert Y says this other thing, and you report both. That's what I do. I don't like to write about green finance because the examples you have on are often not really good. I don't know if I'm clear about the issue I have, but that's what I wanted to say.
All right, thank you so much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you so much to everyone. I think I saw a question. Let's see if we can quickly get to that. And then we'll wrap up. But I hope we've all we've all filled our attendance sheet. As you know, that's a very important requirement. Okay, so I don't know if we responded to this. What online platforms are most useful for communicating climate finance education? Personally, I think, Yongo is a very important bit. I don't know if whoever, Olivia, if you want to also be part of the communications group. I see our focal point here, Genero, so I'll just hand over to Jen now to, sort of give us his final address before we call it a day.
No, thank you very much, Irene, and thank you, Alexandre. I was not expecting to talk today, but now that I have the chance, hello everyone. Thank you so much for being part of this session. I am the contact point of the Finance and Market Working Group. We usually build spaces so youngsters can build common positions on climate finance negotiations. And we're really happy to see all these amazing people training and getting their capacities built so they can build professionally and personally. And I invite you, like I said in the comments, becoming a reporter on climate finance can start in like capacity building like this, and also sharing on social media is very important, since climate finance topics, as you might know, is very technical and needs to be lowered down in a common language so everyone can understand, and so we can all be part of this slowly. So Yongo is our constituency, and I'll share the link if you want to join as a member of the mailing list. And tomorrow we are going to have a constituency call. So also I invite you all to kindly join. You can find all the information in Instagram or LinkedIn. And regarding the question, yeah, LinkedIn, social media, Twitter, is usually very good social media tools to communicate on climate finance topics. But never forget to do it also at a local level with your neighbors, with your family. It's very important that this information gets to all levels of society. So thank you very much, everyone. I'll put the links, and it will be so great to have a family photo as well as us to finish this session. So I will gladly have everyone, if they can turn on your camera, and maybe Karishma, if you can get out the filter exactly, so more people can fit in the photo. And yeah, so we'll wait a few seconds so everyone turns their camera. Yeah, everyone do their favorite pose. Oh, I see someone is in nature. I love that. All right, friends, I'm gonna take the photo in 3, 2, 1. Climate finance.
Hi.
All right, let me paste this into the chat, but I think there are some people that were not able to get in the photo because there are so many of us.
Yeah, so you can do for the 3 frames. I see we have 3 frames. Well, on my laptop, depending on the
this in our chat, and go into the second one. All right, 3, 2, 1. Climate finance. Great. One last one. All right, 3, 2, 1. Great. Thank you all, friends. So
thank you everyone. So we'll see you next week, Friday. Adios.
Don't close the call because I need to save the chat.
Ah, great. Okay.